Most conversations about masculinity today start in the wrong place. People talk about masculinity like it's a personality trait, something you're either born with or something you can just choose to perform. But 50 years ago, nobody had to ask, what does it mean to be a man? The environment answered that question for you. Today, the environment has changed. It has changed dramatically, but men were never taught how to redesign themselves for the new load. In engineering, when a system built for one environment is suddenly exposed to another, instability may occur. And that's what this video is all about. It's not about identity, it's about a system design. Before we go deeper, I want to point something out that almost nobody mentions. Today, the masculinity conversations became polarized. You hear be alpha, be stoic, be confident, man up, lead, protect, provide. But identity is not an input, identity is an output. And if you don't understand the system behind masculinity, then every solution you try will fail. Now, it isn't just a YouTube opinion, this is actually widely documented. The American Psychological Association, APA, published guidelines showing that debate around traditional masculinity is one of the most contentious psychological topics today. A 2023 Pew Research Center study found that most Americans believe masculinity is changing and that young men are unsure what society expects of them. The Harvard Men and Boys Project report rising loneliness, declining sense of purpose, and identity confusion, which is very prevalent in men under 30. Books like Richard Reeves of Boys and Men shows data that men are struggling educationally, socially, and economically, not because they lack masculinity, but because they lack direction in changing environment. So the issue isn't that men suddenly became weak, it's that nobody taught men how to define their actual problem. And every engineer knows this. If you misdefine a problem, then every solution will be wrong. That's the difference here. I'm not selling you identity. I'm trying to teach you how to think like an engineer, how to understand the system you operate in, the loads you are under, and the failure modes you're experiencing. Because once you can define a problem clearly, you don't need anyone to tell you how to be a man. You'll be able to rebuild yourself from the ground up, from first principles. So let's begin with context. To define a problem, we need to understand the system that exists before and the system that exists now. In the 70s, masculinity wasn't debated, it was defined by the environment. There was a clear role of a provider, protector, builder, or stable careers, manufacturing, trades, long-term employment, economic predictability. There was less technological noise, there was no social media. Local communities provided mentorship, families were larger, more independent, and there was less ambiguity in dating and relationships. The purpose was tied to tangible contributions. Men didn't need to find themselves. The world told them exactly what they were and what they were expected to do. There was structure, predictability, and a clear pathway from boyhood to manhood. Now, I want you to compare that to today. Infinite career paths, remote work, less physical labor, more cognitive labor, global competition, social media comparison, less community, fewer mentors, delayed adulthood, confusion around family roles, increased economic instability, culturally polarized expectations of men. There's tons of them out there. And as Richard Reeves writes, men are experiencing a role redefining crisis. The world changed, but the script didn't. In engineering terms, what this means is that the external environment completely shifted. but men were still running the old design parameters. So before we talk about strategies for a solution, what we want to do is we want to be able to define the problem, because the problem is not men are less masculine. The real problem is masculinity was once an inherited identity. A man didn't need to construct it. He stepped into a role that society handed him, but those roles have dissolved. Today, masculinity is not a template to follow, but a system each man must intentionally create. To understand this, let's look at a real engineering failure. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge wasn't a bad design. It was actually an elegant, minimal, efficient bridge, but it was designed for a certain type of wind load and lacked torsional stiffness. When exposed to different wind patterns, not stronger, but just different, it entered into an aeroelastic flatter. And these oscillations amplified. There was no damping, and the structure all of a sudden collapsed. Engineers learned a timeless lesson that a system that works in one environment can become unstable if it's exposed to another. And this is the story of masculinity, of modern masculinity that we see today. The load changed, the environment changed, the constraint changed, but men are still trying to operate with a design which has been optimized for the 70s. That mismatch, not weakness, mismatch, is the cause of instability today. Let's break masculinity down as a system. You have inputs, processing, outputs, environment, constraints, and failure modes. Inputs are what shapes a man today. Family expectations, which are less defined, cultural expectations, which can be contradictory, economic pressure, which is higher, role models, there are fewer nowadays, social media, there's a constant comparison. The other side, environment, there is more uncertainty, biological drives, unchanged but suppressed. We also have processing, the internal architecture. These are beliefs, cognitive models, emotional regulation, ability to delay gratification, interpretation of stress, ability to tolerate failure. And then we move on to outputs. These are identity in behaviors. So confidence, boundaries, leadership, stability, competence, direction, purpose. Identity is simply the visible output of all these invisible systems. The environment is completely different from 50 years ago. The 70s had low noise, stable expectations. Today, as opposed to the 70s, we have high noise and a lot of conflicting expectations, a lot of unpredictability. The constraints are weak or non-existent. Constraints create clarity, and without constraints, men are experiencing paralysis, oscillation, drift. Then we have failure modes, where modern men break. There is identity collapse. There is oscillation under emotional load. There is paralysis due to too many options, emotional volatility, anger, shutdown cycles, dependency on external validation, lack of purpose, inconsistent behavior, avoidance of responsibility, fear of rejection or risk. None of these are moral failures. They're really engineering failures in the fact that there are poorly defined constraints. There is excessive environmental noise. There is no damping systems, no stable load-bearing structure, and most importantly, outdated operating assumptions. This is the most important part of this video. Every engineer begins with the same rule. Define the problem with precision, or the solution will fail. What I like to do is I'd like to provide a 3-step diagnostic method that we'll use throughout this series. The first step: what is failing? It's not, I'm not masculine, but instead it is, I shut down during conflict. I lose stability under uncertainty. I cannot maintain consistency. I oscillate emotionally. I avoid responsibility or pressure. I feel purposeless or directionless. These are functions that are failing, not identity. Step number 2: under what load does it fail? We don't want to hear vague stories like, everything stresses me out, life is just too hard right now, I can't handle this pressure, I fall apart when things go wrong. But instead, what we want is clearly defined loads like, under direct conflict with my partner, I shut down instead of staying engaged. When my work is ambiguous, for example, and expectations are unclear, I procrastinate and I avoid decisions. When I'm responsible for others, I become anxious and overly controlling. When I'm rejected or criticized, I spiral into self-doubt and I stop taking action. And when I face long-term uncertainty about money or career, I numb myself instead of planning. Step number 3: what proves the failure? Evidence. Not emotional labels like, I just feel like a loser, I'm always messing things up, nothing ever works out for me, I'm not built for this. Instead, what you're looking for are observable patterns like, in the last 3 conflicts, I walked away or went silent instead of communicating. I've quit or changed direction every time a project reached a difficult phase. I check out with screens or distractions whenever I feel overwhelmed, instead of addressing the problem. I say I want deeper relationship, but I avoid hard conversations and I never set boundaries. My sleep, training, and focus all collapse whenever I hit a setback, and it takes me weeks to recover. What I would like to do now is I'd like to give you 3 examples of personas. Persona number 1, it's a directionless 25-year-old. The failure mode is, there is no architecture. The load is infinite choices, paralysis. The environment is this gig economy. There are no mentors. The evidence is the fact that the person is constantly job switching. It's identity shifting. And it's misdefined. The problem is misdefined by saying, I'm not driven enough. The correct definition should be, under open load condition, I lack constraints and decision frameworks. In other words, I have way too many choices and no clear rules to help me decide, so I end up staying stuck. A second persona can be an overloaded 35-year-old father. In this case, the failure mode is identified as role overload. The load itself is a responsibility and a financial pressure. And the environment is a high cost of living, limited support. Evidence could be demonstrated by irritability, like guilt, self-criticism. It is typically misdefined by, I'm failing as a man, when in reality the correct definition is, under compound load, my emotional damping system is insufficient. In other words, there are too many responsibilities that hit me at the same time, and I don't have a good way to stay calm when pressures build. And a third persona can be a 22-year-old validation seeker. A failure mode can be defined as external input dependency. The load is a social media comparison. Evidence, this can be seen through anxiety and inconsistency. They're generally misdefined by stating something like, I lack confidence, when the correct definition is that my feedback loop is external, not internal, creating unstable identity. In other words, I depend too much on what others think, so I don't really know who I am inside. So, what I'd like to do now is I'd like to bring this back full cycle. 50 years ago, masculinity didn't need to be defined. It was built into the environment. And today, the environment changed, but the internal architecture did not. That mismatch, like an old bridge facing new winds, is the source of instability. And before we talk about strategies, tools, or solutions, you must learn to define the problem with engineering precision. Because once you know what is failing and under what load and with what evidence, you no longer need anyone to tell you how to be a man. You'll know exactly what subsystem to redesign. In the next two videos, I am going to help you complete the system. Video 2 will give you the engineering toolkit, damping, constraints, feedback loops, capacity, and the system design principles that explain how stable men can stay stable. And in video 3, we'll give you the practical blueprint. These are the daily activities, the routines, the boundaries, and the strategy for actually building a masculine identity. Not as a performance, but as an engineered system that works in the real world. If this helped you think a little bit more clearly or gave you a different perspective, then consider subscribing. Not for validation, but so that you don't miss the next steps in designing yourself from first principles. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you have a great day.